Nobody knows even why some houses are called haunted.
What would you call this place?
Well, diseased, sick, crazy, if you like. Such houses are described in the Bible as leprous. Before that, an homeless race for the underworld. A house of Hades.
Hi everybody, this is Irene Allen from the Paranormal UK radio show, the flagship show of the Paranormal UK radio network. And I've got a new host with me today. Mark is not here any longer. He is taken up with work commitments. So I've now got myself a new host, Christian Delaney.
Hi. Hi everybody, how are you? Are you all right?
Hi. Hiya, Christian.
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm fine too. And sitting in the background, and will be joining in on the show every now and then, but monitoring me and making sure that I do everything right, is Chris Evers.
Hello there, everybody. Nice to be with you once again. Hello, Irene. Hello, Christian.
Hi, Chris.
Well,
this is going to get confusing, isn't it, with Christian and
yes,
Chris?
yes.
I can see this now.
Well, it will, because I keep calling Christian Chris.
Yeah.
Chris.
Probably best calling
and
Christian.
And I've got to try and stop calling Christian Chris, and call Christian Christian.
Yeah.
I will try. Okay, Chris?
Yeah, that's fine by me. All I'm going to do is just sit here in the background, and I'll be acting like the referee. Yeah, I'll have the yellow flag to chuck in when, penalty, I'll be handling that this evening, really.
Okay.
Maybe one or two questions as we go.
Well, one thing we're lucky about, I've not got Chris as a guest. I've got Craig and Chris, Craig, Christian. See what's going to happen.
The three C's.
Anyway, Craig's back with us for a second part of the show. We done a show with Craig a month ago, which I enjoyed very much. He's known for his brilliant photography and his passion for historical research. On the last show, we talked about his work with haunted hotels, but there's so much more left unspoken, so we're going back into that very, very soon. Craig has a book out called Haunted by History, so people, please go and get that book. You can get it on Amazon and off of Craig's website, which is, now wait for it, this is going to get me tongue-tied, bizarre.com. I think you better say that, Craig.
Yeah, it's actually Bizarre LA. That's the best way to do it. Bizarre LA is in Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm still trying to say it all as one word.
Yes, Bizarre LA, isn't it, I think, from what I remember.
Bizarre LA. Okay, Craig.
Well, my mom, who lives in Texas, she calls it Bizarrella. And I thought, that's kind of cool. I need to find a model, kind of like Elvira, and just call her Bizarrella.
Yeah.
Dress her up in some kind of goth thing, and she could be the spokesperson for the website and for the book. But I had a good laugh over that. It never occurred to me that people could come up with different things. I thought it was just safe, Bizarre LA.
Sounds like something Disney forgot to draw, doesn't it, Bizarrella?
Bizarrella, like down your dark gothic hair,
Well, anyway, that's where you can get his book, Haunted by History, on I still can't say it.
Just say
Bizarre LA. Yeah, bizarrela.com, people. Oh, gosh. Well, at the very end of the show, Craig will mention that, not me. Okay? Right, so where are we going on with this, Craig? We were just having a little chat about the Queen Mary just now when we were off air.
Yes, we were talking about the Queen Mary and just all the different ghost stories. They're about to start making a movie, an American movie based on the haunting. So it's going to be kind of like what the Winchester Mystery House movie was about. And so I think that's kind of the trend right now in Hollywood, is to take already well-known haunted locations and then make this ghost story based around it. and of course distort everything, beyond reason. So the Queen Mary's finally going to get her due as a subject matter for a paranormal ghost story themed movie.
Oh,
That sounds cool. It's really
Well, back in the 90s or early thousands, there was this really bad movie called Ghost Ship that kind of came
Oh, I
in
remember
then.
that. That was
And,
terrible.
that was based on the Queen Mary. Well, I don't expect the Queen Mary movie to be much better than that, to be
Oh,
honest with you. But yes, it's always considered one of the most haunted locations in they say around the world, but definitely Southern California.
I don't think we ever looked on, when she was in service, I don't think we ever looked on her as being haunted. She was just an old ship and it was time to get rid of her, and you lot bought her the same way as you thought you were buying Tower Bridge and ended up with London Bridge.
Well,
I've got to get that dig in.
Oh,
interestingly enough, it's going to be featured in Volume 2, or I may just actually, what I researched and wrote about the Queen Mary is there's so much information to cover that it actually can be its own standalone book. And obviously other writers have, written tons of books just devoted to the Queen Mary by itself.
Yeah.
However, I do think that what I came up with is certainly the most historically accurate, not just from a maritime point of view, but definitely from a paranormal point of view, because they shoot holes in a lot of the stories that are told. Yet there are many others that I actually believe and cannot refute. So. I will say this, and my point is, quite frankly, is that when it was still, under the Cunard White Star Line, it was in about the mid-50s, there were definitely ghost stories.
Was that?
On board the ship. And
so roughly how many ghosts do you think are on there, Craig? Have we got a whole, is she completely booked up?
Well, back in 1990, there was a psychic named Peter James who was kind of a self-proclaimed psychic, who, went on television and said that there were like over 500 ghosts or something on board the Queen Mary. And of course, that was a laughable number. And yet a lot of people just naturally accepted it. Over the years, prior to his death in 2007, James started paring down the number in case anyone was keeping a scorecard on what he was saying. He was basically saying that he was really only aware of 150, and then out of that he only talked to like 25. So the number goes way down from 500, which he had made, back around 1989. 1990. Now, to answer your question, how many ghosts do I think is there? When you're talking about consistent paranormal, say, personalities, we're talking about sightings like a woman in a white dress, or a ghost that growls, or a ghost that is like a woman singing, like a if you take these personality traits, it does seem to be closer to about maybe 20 that are consistent over the years.
So his score of 500, that would have filled up about just every cabin, but 20
or so, yeah. So I don't think so, but there could be definitely more than 20. It's just that there seems to be at least between 15 and 20 fairly consistent claims that personalities from ghost children, or at least one ghost child, maybe two or three. There's a man in a black tuxedo that's supposedly been seen around there. There's someone dressed as a ship captain.
That's meant to be a woman in the swimming pool, isn't there? Or goes to the swimming pool. According to most haunted, anyway.
Yeah, let's call that an urban legend. However, I definitely have my own theories in there about all of this and what's going on. But just for the record, there are no records whatsoever, no known records, I should say, that of any drownings in the swimming pool. And see, that was something that was started in 1988 it was actually started in 1983, but by 1988 it started getting pretty much pushed by the publicity department for the Queen Mary, the management. And so they were going with maybe 2-3 drownings, and they all were supposedly female. And that's when Peter James entered the scene, and he was really just kind of taking the talking points that the publicists had already established and then attaching more personalities and putting names behind these fictitious ghosts that drowned, or ghosts of people that drowned in the swimming pool. But the truth of the matter was, the Queen Mary was subject to rolling during storms, and anytime there was any kind of turbulence on the ocean, that's the first thing that was shut down are the swimming pools, and most people don't realize that. I mean, so those pools were only operational on nice days where there's calm weather.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have the stabilizers, I doubt, in those days that they've got on the ships nowadays.
They didn't get a stabilizer until the late 50s, and by that time it was a little too late for the Queen Mary, because she was already losing, business to airplanes and faster ships and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, she was built in Clydebank, wasn't she, in Scotland?
Pardon?
Wasn't she built at Clydebank?
Yes.
Scotland.
Yes, she was. Yes, she was built in Scotland and Clydebank. And thank you for saying that, because, I'll read these words and I know how to spell them, but sometimes I don't know how to say them.
I'll tell you why I did say that was because I've had my relatives are from Scotland and a lot of Glasgow, and a lot of them worked there. In fact, I had a cousin that worked on the QE2, the last one, the QE2. Mm-hmm. And do you remember on her maiden voyage, the plumbing went wrong? Well, and she was grounded out at sea for a while because they had trouble with the plumbing. Well, my cousin was the plumber. he done plumbing on that ship. So whether it was down to him or not, I don't know. But, yeah.
Well, what's interesting, though, about the ghosts, let's talk about the ghost children in specific, because everyone talks out here in L.A., and probably elsewhere in the country. They talk about a ghost child named Jackie Torin, who, and Peter James, the psychic that I had mentioned beforehand, he had come up with that name himself, and he was saying that she was a little girl that died in the second-class swimming pool, which is no longer in existence, and that she now haunts the first-class swimming pool. And there's no record. I mean, people for years have been trying to do genealogy, trying to find any sign of a Jackie Torin, and it's a weird spelling, and people have tried different spellings just in the event that Peter James' spelling was wrong, and they just can't find anything of that nature of any child by that name on a voyage, any child by that name really living during that time. And most certainly no records of a child drowning in the swimming pool. So I think you can kind of, put to bed that there may be a ghost child, but her name's not Jackie Torin. And I think that's really that's my case and that's my argument. Now, some people will swear, but I've got her to talk to me when I call out her name. And I always just say, well, did you ever try any other name? Because she probably would answer to just about anything. And then I've heard, people say, well, maybe it's a thought form, which is a paranormal theory that if enough people believe in something strongly, that they're,
kind of creates a tulpa.
They actually can create the ghost itself. And And I'm not a big believer in that because, I always say, well, if you want to talk about thought forms, Jesus would have come back a long time ago because there's a lot more collected people that believe that he's coming, and they would have willed it had there been any power to that thought form idea. But they also are missing the boat, pun intended, because they're not researching to realize that there were ghost children reports going back to the mid-1950s. What's interesting, though, about the Queen Mary's ghost children reports is that in the 50s and even into the 60s, they were mostly heard and seen up on the upper decks where the passengers actually stayed. And people would hear them romping around the hallways. People would hear them playing in an unoccupied cabin. They would hear children crying out and doing all sorts of things. So they'd open the door, thinking something is going on. Why are there kids in this cabin when no one's supposed to be in there? They open up the door and nothing's inside. Nobody's inside.
Yeah.
There was one report of, and this was documented in a book called Adventures of the Queen Mary by an author named James. I'd have to look it up. He's a really nice guy. I actually recommend this book, and it is available in the UK. Adventures on the Queen Mary. And what it is it's a recollection by one of the stewards that worked on the Queen Mary in the 1950s, who's still alive, and he put down his memoirs, and it was published in book form. And he talks about those stories in the book. And I always say, well, when people ask me what's the best paranormal book out there about the Queen Mary, I say it's Adventures on the Queen Mary, although it only devotes like one chapter to the ghost itself. I found it after reading all of the books on the Queen Mary ghost, this one was the best one. But one of the stories he recalls in his book has to do with a crew member that was, I believe, practicing a cornet or a trumpet. And he would go down to the very bowels of the ship and he would practice in a meat locker. So he didn't disturb anybody. And one time while he was down there practicing in a meat locker, he heard a little girl ghost down there. And it freaked him out. So ghost children were all over, but nowadays they're mostly seen or heard in the first-class swimming pool. Yeah. And that first-class swimming pool is really the paranormal hotspot on the entire, what's left of the Queen Mary. I don't call it ship anymore because legally it's not. It's legally a building. Yeah. And so I just call it Queen Mary Attraction and try to avoid calling it a ship anymore. But that first-class swimming pool is where a great deal of the paranormal activity takes place. And my theory behind why you don't really see too many or hear any reports of ghost children on the upper decks anymore probably has to do with energy and the transference of energy as a source for manifestations. Once they docked the Queen Mary in Long Beach in 1967, they turned off all and actually removed most of the engine work, and then they put in their own electrical power and to kind of keep electricity inside the former ship. Yeah. And once they turned off the master clock and all the humming, there was no real power up on the upper decks anymore, no electricity to kind of feed the paranormal activity up there. However, the area that seems to have the most concentrated paranormal activity these days are the area where there are engines and there are generators and there's electricity. And so it should come as no surprise to people that study the paranormal that this area where that's more electrified would be the center of where paranormal activity would happen.
You're saying that, though, Craig, It's strange, really, because when you think about the old castles here in Wales that haven't got any electricity going to them, they're just shucks.
Yeah,
And yet there's paranormal activity rife around some of them.
yeah.
And they're
Well,
stuck up on hilltops in the middle of the wilds with trees and forests around them, and there's nothing.
Well, here's another point that I was going to get to, and this kind of explains why some castles have a lot of paranormal activity without a lot of, running electrical motors and generators and whatnot. Is in that first class swimming pool, the ceiling is actually made of crystal quartz, which is a conductor of electricity. It's like a storage.
Yeah, and this may be the reason why a lot of these castles are built up on mounds and things like that, not only so that they can see the enemy coming, but maybe it's something in the ground that's hard.
Limestone is supposed to be a conductor. There's several different rocks that are conductors. Also water, if any castles are built near a major or even a large lake.
The last one I took a photograph of a ghost at, Clonstefan Castle here in Wales, is right overlooking the sea.
Yes.
She stands proud overlooking the sea.
Well, see, the water has long been believed to be also a conduit of paranormal activity, and that also could be contributing to why the Queen Mary was active with ghosts on the upper decks while it was at sea, while it was literally doing, ocean crossings.
Yeah,
there's all kinds of different theories. We're talking theories anyway. We're not or hype. Someone pointed out that theories are provable, but so maybe I should say they're opinions as opposed to theories.
Yeah, I think Chris wants to ask you a question. Do you, Chris?
Sure.
Yeah, I was just reading up about the Queen Mary.
This is Christian, by the way, not
yes, it's the other Christian. Yeah,
I'm still sat in the background listening in.
I noticed it said something about at the outbreak of the Second World War, it was converted into a troop ship, the Queen Mary.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it ferried Allied soldiers during the war. Now, to me, war is quite an intense, emotional time, and there's a lot of residual energy that's going to be left behind, which I think spirits can feed off. And also, if people come into a room, I mean, I've been into a room sometimes and I've felt like there's almost like a tangible emotion being left behind that's like an imprint on time and space.
Yes.
And do you get that same feeling when you get into the Queen Mary? Because you've been there, you said you were there last year, didn't you? I think you said.
Yeah, I go there about once a year, sometimes twice. And I've been doing that off and on for years. I would say that the vast majority of the paranormal activity, in my opinion, is a direct result of its service in World War II.
Right.
Even the ghost children. Like I said, there are no reports of actually any children dying, except for one report of a child it was just a newborn. And it was during the bride and baby voyages after Germany fell and the war was over, and they were just bringing war brides and their children from Europe to America. Sometimes it docked in New York, sometimes it docked in Canada, but most of the time it docked in New York. So they would bring, and these were, called bride and baby voyages, and they lasted about a year. 1945, 1946, somewhere around that area. My point is that I'm thinking the ghost children might even be somehow connected to those bride and baby voyages, while there's no reports of children dying on the ship when it was just run by Cunard White Star Line. The bride and baby voyages were still considered classified voyages, which I discovered through my research. So this one report of a newborn baby dying within a day or two after it was born on the ship, that might have been a breach in security and it leaked out. But that's the best that I could do. Now all this talk about all these tales of murder and whatnot that was supposedly went on back when it was a luxury liner, that's all just nonsense because you're dealing with international waters and Cunard White Star Line. There's no way you can hide. You cannot hide crimes or sweep it under the rug. It has to be reported in New York City. And there were times in the history of the relationship of the two countries and the Queen Mary, there were times when the U.S. got upset a little bit with the Queen Mary and Cunard. One had to do with it did have to do with a child who, I want to say the parents, or had something to do with Russia, the U.S. This was during the Cold War. And apparently there was a matter of defection going on, and the Queen Mary was a vessel in which this child was supposed to be on, or a ticket, or a child was smuggled on board the ship, and the parents were of Russian or Soviet back then lineage, and so there was a battle as to whether or not this child should be allowed on the ship or not, much less carried across the country, across the ocean. But apparently Russia had ordered, or the Soviet Union had ordered this Russian couple to come back to the USSR. And they're supposed to take the child with them. And the United States tried to block that. And I believe
was the child actually born in America, do you think?
I believe
they blocked it?
I'd have to go back and relook at it. What I think happened is I believe that the Queen Mary was not allowed to leave port until the U.S. gave permission, and I believe it just finally took off on its own and did so anyway. And so the child, there was an agreement that the child had to go before the British court in the British system, and that they would take care of it and not the U.S. And that is exactly what happened. And I believe the child was allowed to stay and the crossing was justified. But these are, that's one example of a, some kind of tension and the Queen Mary kind of getting caught between the two. So, in other words, my point is, Cunard White Star, if there was a murder, it would have been reported. It would have had to have been.
Well, all deaths have got to be reported, haven't
exactly.
Can
Yeah. Well, sure.
I was just going to read you something I've just discovered about Queen Mary. I don't know if it's relevant. It says here, on the 2nd of October 1942, Queen Mary accidentally sank one of the escort ships,
Yes.
slicing through the light cruiser HMS Kurosawa. Sorry, off the Irish coast with a loss of 239 lives.
Oh, no.
Now, that's significant, surely, and that is going to have definitely made an impact. And also, just one other thing I'd like to add is during World War II, they changed the colour to grey, and everyone then nicknamed it the Grey Ghost.
Yeah, well, let me tell you the
That's
truth
really
about
interesting,
that.
isn't it?
Well, let me tell you the truth about that, because that's also kind of a distortion as well. But the Kurosawa, yes, and there are definitely plenty of people, and I have no issue with this, that they think that that Kurosawa incident is partly responsible for the paranormal activity there.
Right.
Some people have actually claimed to have heard the sound of twisting metal down in the near the head of the ship where the collision would have taken place, and heard screams, and it was believed that those large propellers on the Queen Mary may have just chopped people to bits, under the water, and it was kept a secret until after the war, and it was then it was investigated, and they mostly found the Kurosawa to be the blame, although part of the blame was put on the Queen Mary itself. But the Queen Mary was given strict orders, and, everything's zigzagging. That's what the Queen Mary did. When it made its crossing, it was zigzagging because there were all kinds of U-boats out there that they were worried about, and there was a bounty put on the Queen Mary by Hitler, and there were little traps laid out for the Queen Mary, and fortunately, British and American intelligence were so good that they were able to, in most cases, identify all of these booby traps and steer clear of them. Now, the Queen Mary was often given orders not to stop for anything. And so when it cut through the Kurosawa, it had to keep going. So it didn't stop to do any kind of rescues. It just kept going. And it was left to other boats, nearby boats, to try to salvage and try to rescue what they could. And that one was a disaster, to be sure. Now, the Grey Ghost. Let's talk about the Grey Ghost. The Grey Ghost, really, that name started in World War I, not World War II.
Right.
Any ship, any and every ship that was pressed into service and painted gray was called a Grey Ghost. And so the Queen Mary was not the Grey Ghost, it was a Grey Ghost. The Normandy, which was the French liner, the SS Normandy, which was the chief competitor of the Queen Mary in the 1930s, they were constantly racing each other to see who could win the world record for fastest speed across the Atlantic. When England and France declared war on Germany, the SS Normandy immediately went to New York and was docked, and it was also painted gray immediately, and it was called a Grey Ghost. What happened with the Normandy, unfortunately, was, France fell rather quickly once Germany invaded. It fell rather quickly, and so the SS Normandy was just kind of left there. What do you do with it? So the United States decided that they were going to take over that ship and use it as a transport. And while they were fitting it out in New York, fitting it out to be a transport ship, a fire started and it capsized the liner. So it was never used officially as a transport ship. So once the United States lost the Normandy, which they had renamed it, they gave it an American name and everything. Once they had lost it to fire, then they asked to share the Queen Mary. And the Queen Mary had a sister ship called the Queen Elizabeth.
That's right.
And the Queen Elizabeth was also painted gray, and it was a Grey Ghost too. And the Kurosawa, I believe, was a Grey Ghost. I mean, there were many Grey Ghosts, but I thought that was a lot of paranormal types and authors. They talk about Queen Mary called the Grey Ghost. How cool is that? How spooky? It fits in with the ghost thing. But really and truly, it wasn't a nickname just specifically given to the Queen Mary itself. They were calling World War I transport ships that were painted, that were acquisitioned by the government to serve in the war. They were once you got that gray paint on, you were a Grey Ghost.
Mm-hmm. And I think all service ships today are painted grey, aren't they? They've got a hell of a lot of that paint in storage, I tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, Craig?
Sure.
This is Chris, not Christian.
Sure.
Of course, there are. We know that the Queen Mary saw deaths on board the ship itself. I think we mentioned that earlier, where something around about 49 in total were reported on the actual boat itself. And we also, as you've just discussed about, the Queen Mary cutting the ship in two. Now, there were reports of bangings on the side of the ship coming from the survivors that were from that ship that was cut in two, trying to get on board the Queen Mary. And, it's saying around about 300 people were left in the water, and they were making short shrift of by drowning or sharks coming in to get them. Now, there are also reports of a particular room on board Queen Mary. I think is it B340?
Yes.
Yeah. What is the story behind B340?
Okay. Well, that I'm glad you asked, because that needs to be discussed too. Okay. B340 today is the Queen Mary is renting it for $500 a night. They're calling it the most haunted cabin on the Queen Mary, and they have Ouija boards, crystal ball, tarot cards. They got all kinds of different things in there. That's just part of a kit. Well, that should be a red flag right there. If it's a truly haunted room, you wouldn't need any of that stuff there, right? In fact, it would probably be somewhat discouraging to have that in. But here's the real story. In 1988, well, from the early 80s to about 1988, there was a corporation that owned the contract to run the Queen Mary, and it was the Rather Corporation. And the Rather Corporation owned the Disneyland Hotel. They owned the rights to the Lone Ranger, and they owned the rights to a lot of different stuff. But they wanted this. They wanted the Queen Mary contract. Disney wanted the Disneyland Hotel, but the Rather Corporation would never sell it to them. Then when Jack Rather, I think his name was Jack, when the head honcho of the Rather Corporation passed away, Disney got aggressive, and they bought all of the Rather properties, including getting the contract to operate the Queen Mary. And this happened around 1988, 1989. So Disney, in wanting to get the Disneyland Hotel, they took on the Queen Mary lease. Well, Disney went in, they looked around, they didn't call it Disney's Queen Mary, because they weren't sure whether they wanted it or not. But they went in there and they looked around and they said, well, okay, let's see what we can do with it a little bit. So they heard it was haunted. They were intrigued by that. The haunting part and the ghost part was the only marketing thing that seemed to work in getting people to come back to the Queen Mary more than once. So Disney was aware of that, so they decided to put in a special effects tour as part of the Queen Mary, as just kind of an experimental thing. But they also had other tours, and one was like a ghost walking tour. Now, when they were going through, they mapped out the corridors and the hallways where they wanted to do this ghost walking tour, and they realized they needed a haunted cabin. So what they did is they took two cabins that hadn't been used in years. They were used for storage at the time, and they declared, this is going to be our most haunted cabin. So what they did is they cleared it up. They hired a psychic, they hired about 5 psychics. They paired them up with writers who followed them around. Disney was worried that there weren't enough ghosts on the Queen Mary, and everyone wanted to see and experience a ghost. So their rationale was, let's give them ghosts, okay? So walking around with these psychics, they came into this thing, and they came up with a story about a purser that was murdered in the room. And part of this was a combination of psychic impressions. Part of it was just taking ghost stories from other cabins and other parts of the ship and just putting them all into one. So what they did with B340, which is what it became, is that they rigged it so that it had all kinds of special effects inside the room. Can you hear me okay?
God,
Yeah,
I wouldn't sleep in that. You don't know what they've got in there. They might have cameras and that.
Hello?
Are you there?
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear us, Craig?
Oops. Hello.
Craig.
Are you there, Craig?
Hello.
Craig, we can hear you fine.
Okay, I'm back again.
Not that
You
time.
never went.
I don't know what happened. I think I must have pressed a button on my mic and muted
You must have
myself.
muted yourself.
I was
We
just
thought, we
saying,
thought the spirits had been in then and got you.
Ah,
I was just saying, Craig, you know, I wouldn't rent that room because when I rent a room, I rent a room to get into bed and go to sleep. And there's no way I would rent that room if they'd rigged it with everything because there might be hidden cameras in there still.
well, you know something, I like to stay in the haunted rooms. I don't sleep with the darn, but I like I love the adventure of it, and I think that's what a lot of people. That's what they want, is the adventure of it. But anyway, I don't know what got cut off, but once Disney came in, they put a two-way mirror, you know, so that people could see another apparition popping up. They had a chair that rocked on its own. They put fake blood stains on the floor. And then they did some other things. They had a faucet that would like turn on and off by itself. And so there was these things, and they also would pipe in odd sounds from hidden speakers inside the room.
So they went a little bit over the top then.
They went, yeah, it was like a mini version of Disney's Haunted Mansion, just in that room, to create a paranormal, a feel to it. Then, and so they would have tour guides talk about, they would talk about the murder that took place there and how the poltergeist activity was so intense that they no longer used it as an operational cabin anymore. So it's now just part of the tour. And of course, it's all made up. And it's on record as being made up. If you ever go through the old Los Angeles Times archive, the historian says it's bogus. The LA Times reporter covering the opening of this made it clear that this is not real. You know, this is make-believe. Well, what happened is they did propose a Disney theme park around the Queen Mary property, but they weren't interested in doing any repairs on the ship itself, or the former ship, which was falling into disrepair. So when the city of Long Beach, which owns the Queen Mary, insisted that they absolutely have to put money into restoration, Disney basically, and I'm paraphrasing, but they said, you know, basically that we're in the theme park business, we're not in the historic preservation business, goodbye. And so they walked away and shocked everybody. They would not renew the lease. So the Queen Mary actually shut down for about 3-4 months, and Disney had pulled out all of its special effects and out of the ship and left. And so once they did find someone to take over, it was a man who had been with the Rather Corporation in an earlier incarnation. So he took over the lease, and he didn't have the money at that time to get B340 operational as a special effect laden room. But he did raise money to create his own special effect tour in the space where Disney had theirs. And what he did is he opened up B340 as the most haunted cabin, but they changed the stories around. And so it became, depending on what tour and what year, it was a different story. One had to do with a father that murdered his wife and kids, you know, in the cabin. That was one of the stories. There was a story of a prostitute that was killed there. There was all kinds of different silly stories. None of it happened. So, however, people kept believing this stuff, and it did get really ratty inside B340, where it looked like hell, to speak, you know. And so finally, I guess under this new management, they decide, hey, you know, let's turn it into a $500 a night room that you can actually stay in. And it's so funny in a way, because once they did that, you have all these YouTubers that had their own paranormal shows, you know, and they got huge followings, and they'll go and rent this place, and they don't know that it's all fake. And so when you start watching their YouTube videos and you see like a light suddenly falling off of a nightstand and a door opening and closing, that's a real good indication that these guys, these YouTubers, are faking their evidence.
Yeah. I think it's such a shame that they have to turn a boat into an entertainment thing like that. You know, why can't they just go there and, you know, just have the normal ghosts and everything? Why do, if there is any ghosts, why do they have to do all this? You know, it's all money, isn't it?
Yeah. I have, as you know, Irene, I live in Kingston upon Hull.
Yeah.
And I live about 700 yards away from what is described as one of the most haunted properties in the United Kingdom.
Oh, yeah.
Which is 39
Council
Grey
House.
Street. Yep. Well, it's not a council house. You're thinking of the one in Pontefract, probably there. East Drive, sorry. This one, 39 Grey Street. It's been described as the UK's most haunted home. It's had women being dragged out of bed by the throat in the middle of the night. It's said to have kids that have died in there, coming out of the wall towards people. One child being locked in the basement. But I don't think there is a basement in the building, but there you go. You know, it's had all this kind of activity, and there's said to be an indistinct evil presence in the property. It's said to have at one point been...
And this is another property that has all been concocted, is it?
Yes, yeah, they call it the hostel now, but... As we have a mutual friend by the name of Mike Covell who once put together an article for Outer Limits magazine, and he actually delved into the history of the property and all the claims that have been made that, one, it's impossible to investigate properly because nobody can find any records, and two, it was once a joiner's property where they made coffins. And it's also been a funeral parlour. He's actually debunked every single thing about the property and what it has come down to. I mean, it costs £60 a night, which I would imagine, Craig, is somewhere around about $90 a night to actually go and spend the night there as an individual.
It's cheap.
Frighten yourself to death, you know, for £60 a night.
Yeah,
but it's a cash cow. That's all it's come down to, a cash cow.
Yeah.
I think I'll do it, but I'll do it to see whether or not there's any merit to the ghost stories. I mean, I've read my own little experiments.
Craig, if you want to stay in one of the most haunted places in the UK, come and stay at my house. Now, this is haunted.
Yeah, you told me. That's pretty wild stories there.
Yeah, I tell you, fantastic house this is. I'd make a fortune if I got teams in here, I would. But
yeah.
I wouldn't do that to the house. I just wouldn't do it. And
Craig, if you want to come over, Craig, you want to be in the UK then for Friday the 25th of October 2019, 9 p.m. to 2 a.m, pay £60. While you go and wait for something to happen, which I doubt will, the owner of the property can actually go across road to the pub, spending your £60.
I bet you get more ghosts in the pub than what you would in the property.
You probably get more spirits in the pub.
That's where I was going to go with that. Yeah, more spirits. Yeah.
Are you okay there, Christian?
Yeah, I was just listening. It's learned a lot about the Queen Mary and the association with all the spirit world.
Well, I think she was a beautiful ship.
She still is, she's still a beautiful building.
Well, to me, she's a ship because she's on water.
She's it's technically not a ship for a number of reasons. One is that there's only one propeller; it's non-operational, and that's one of the definitions of a ship is that it has to have a propeller of some sort, and especially of that size. And also,
is she? Sorry, Craig. Is she actually on water or is she in a dry dock?
She's in shallow water, surrounded by a rock wall. The minute they would have to do so much work because if they were literally to take the Queen Mary building and put it out in the ocean of deep, it sink faster than a rock. They've had problems with water seepage off and on for years. And that's the problem is salt water is an acid of sorts.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And it's literally eating through the steel.
Mm. Yeah. It's just I get so upset when people take advantage of these beautiful things like the Queen Mary by concocting all these stupid stories and, like you say, rigging up all this gear just to make it look haunted.
Well, here's the problem. It's
strip it all out and let people go in there and just see the real Queen Mary.
Well, here's the problem with that too. And when Long Beach bought the Queen Mary in the 60s, their idea at the time was to not turn it into a hotel. I think that was maybe part of the plan, but not the main part of it wasn't the main gist. They were wanting to turn it into a museum.
Yeah.
But actually like a giant aquarium, and so that's what they were thinking. They had made a deal with Jacques Cousteau, if you remember him.
Oh, I remember him, yeah.
To do an undersea kingdom inside the bowels of the ship. So once they brought it in, they had a big fight as to whether it was a building or a ship, and that had to do with labor, what labor was allowed to work on it, because both, there's the maritime labor union, and then there's the building, on land labor unions. And so there was a squabble a little bit. Finally, they designated it a building, so that then they dry docked the building, basically, and gutted it.
Mm.
And they over-gutted it. And they did such shoddy work, and the city of Long Beach had decided that they wanted to they assigned a contract for retail, they assigned a contract to the museum, they assigned a contract with a different company to do the restaurants, and so there were like 3 contracts given to 3 different entities, business entities, and none of them were talking to one another about what they were doing. So it's literally none of them were in conjunction, and they actually ended up making it structurally unsound. They had over-gutted it. They weren't using the type of steel reinforcement that ships need because they didn't understand ships. They understood buildings, but apparently some of the steel that they were bringing in wasn't meshing with the steel that was already there.
Yeah.
So everything turned out to be a mess, and they ended up, like I said, over-gutting it and removing so much, thinking that there was just going to be this big underwater aquarium. And Jacques Cousteau never raised the money to build the size aquarium that he had envisioned and had promised to build, so it only took up a real small part of the ship. And like all of their valuable tropical fish started dying because it wasn't the right environment to have an aquarium. And people, once it did open, the Jacques Cousteau Museum, hardly anybody really went. I mean, it got a few crowds for a while. And so they were so in debt. The city of Long Beach was so in debt by all the mistakes that were made. In fact, the person that was in charge of it committed suicide.
Oh, crumbs. Does he own the ship? Sorry.
Just as the scandal was breaking about where the money was going and why it was just this bottomless pit of funds and no progress. There's a suicide, not on board the ship, but there was a suicide, that occurred. Yeah, and
that is sad.
So they immediately just opened it up, and people went up there and they got great crowds, but no one would come back. And part of the reasons why no one would come back is because they had over-gutted. They had taken out many of the best parts, the parts that people would have really loved to have seen.
Yeah.
And they took out all the boiler rooms. They only had one of 3 engine rooms intact. And like the lower decks, the B deck and the C deck, not that they had been, some of them had been gutted. The second class swimming pool, which the old pictures look quite beautiful, that was gutted. in order to be part of the museum, and they turned parts of that into like a theater. The dressing room part of the second class swimming pool was now the screening room in this theater. So people were disappointed. There wasn't enough there.
See, I didn't realize that.
People coming back.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I thought she was intact. You know, everything was still there, and people were just going around looking at her and one thing like that. I didn't know they'd done all this gutting and absolute mutilation to that ship.
Well, fortunately, a lot of the art was kind of saved, but they made a lot of bad decisions in the beginning. I mean, one of the bad things that they did is they took one of the grandest rooms and made it into like a mall food court. That didn't do very well, and you know,
she had beautiful ballrooms and things, didn't she?
Exactly.
Chandeliers and sweeping staircases. You know, it was
yes. Well, no, all those things are still there. Thankfully, a lot of that was saved, but much of the other cool stuff wasn't. In fact, within the last couple of years, what ended up happening is there was a trouble with the toilet, and so they brought in a plumber, and the plumber
it's not my cousin.
Yeah, it was a different one. And when the plumber noticed that there was like a hole in the wall, and he peeked through the hole, and there was a room, and it was where all the anchor chains were, and nobody knew this room existed.
Wow!
It was during the conversion in the late '60s. Nobody knew what they were doing, and the plans were somewhat missing. There's still some artwork that was taken down and misplaced, you know. That they think is still around somewhere, maybe in a warehouse, but
somebody's front room.
But there was just so much confusion over what was going on, and I should point out that all three of those people that had different contracts, they all started suing one another because blaming the other for driving off tourism and killing it off, and then they all were suing the city of Long Beach, and it was just a big headache in the 70s. And what's interesting is that there were reports in the late 60s that the Queen Mary was haunted and that people were genuinely spooked. And the cat kind of left the bag when some British journalists came over to report, and they were asking the crew about the ghosts. And the crew was very openly and talking about it. It gets reported in the UK. Then a Long Beach reporter reads these, and so he's trying to promote it. And the city of Long Beach at first were like going, okay. Many of them have even had experiences themselves, so they were kind of acknowledging. Then a well-known American paranormal guy in the 60s and 70s named Hans Holzer, you may remember him, he heard that the Queen Mary was haunted, and he wrote the city of Long Beach asking permission to do an investigation on board the Queen Mary. And when Hans Holzer wrote the city manager, that apparently angered the city of Long Beach, and that's when they tried to enforce a no-ghost policy, where they clamped down and told employees not to talk about the ghosts anymore. And, of course, they turned down Hans Holzer's request. And so that was when the Queen Mary was suffering. Now, they say that you know, it was years later or decades later when they started opening up the ghost conversation again. That's not quite true. It was only maybe about 3-4 years went by. The Queen Mary first tried to introduce the paranormal back into it in the mid to late 1970s. It was a walking tour of the bowels of the ship that was from the point of view of a ghost dressed as a Commodore. And what was funny is it was just an actor up in the rafters speaking, and he was lip syncing to a pre-recorded voice. telling the story. So he's just a live person lip syncing to some narration, British narration, and that he is the ghost that oversees the Queen Mary. It's like the protecting ghost of the Queen Mary. The problem is that because they had over-gutted the bowels of the ship, the acoustics were horrible, and apparently there were malfunctions with the recording. So he'd be speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, cutting in and cutting out. It kind of blew the whole mysterious effect of this mysterious captain,
I would love to have seen that. I really would. I think I would have been absolutely rolling up on the floor on that.
Oh, I think so too. It was hilarious, and so that got junked after maybe 5-6 months. I mean, that was like, well, that was a bad idea. So, but it bandied around, and then around 1983, the unofficial start of the paranormal promotional publicity machine started to take off. And surprisingly enough, the paranormal talk was the only marketing thing that brought people back a second time.
Yeah.
Because they were studying this very carefully, and people, they wanted to have this Queen Mary attraction to be so good that people will come back again and again and again. And that was the projection. And it wasn't happening. When they were polling people and conducting surveys, people were only going to the Queen Mary once, and that was it. They were walking away disappointed. But once they started promoting the paranormal there, that was when they started getting people making return visits.
Well, I know this is coming up in your second book, Craig.
Yes.
All right, the whole thing on the Queen Mary. And you also said that you go there every year? Roughly every year?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so have you heard, seen, felt, witnessed a ghost or anything?
Yes. I am a big skeptic of the Queen Mary, always have been.
Yeah.
And it's one of those places where I didn't really even want to cover it in any of my books, because it's like everyone has been on the Queen Mary if you're into the paranormal multiple times, and a lot of bad behavior and a lot of really bad paranormal claims, which people just can't wait to post on YouTube and whatnot. And and I noticed, especially around 2000, 2001, there seemed to be a lot of peer pressure where if you went to the Queen Mary and you didn't come out with some kind of paranormal evidence, then you weren't a good investigator. So there was expectation going in and kind of pressure to come out with something. You didn't want people going, oh, you're a moron. You went to the Queen Mary, you didn't find anything? Come on, that's like super haunted. Everybody finds something on the Queen Mary. So I didn't want that kind of pressure, and I didn't want I thought it had been overdone. But at the same time, I can't really do an anthology series on haunted hotels in Southern California and omit the Queen Mary. It had to have been included. So I reluctantly agreed to do it and include it. So I went in very skeptical. And I will say that now I went in at a time when you could go into the first class swimming pool by yourself with a security guard. You pay a certain fee, and you can be there for almost as long as you like. And so I did that. They don't really do that now. And if you can arrange it, it's really expensive. It was expensive when we did it, but I mean, it's astronomical. And now you have to be accompanied by a paranormal investigator as well, the ship's paranormal investigator. And I think there's a time limit. And I'm not even sure they do that anymore, but that was the policy at least a couple of years ago. So back when I was there, I could go down there. So what I did is I had a model, an attractive female model dressed in a 1930s swimsuit, and we went down with a security guard. It was just me and one other male and the female model. So 4 of us all together went down and spent about 3-4 hours in that first class swimming pool. And we didn't catch any ghost children to speak of, but we did catch a few things on audio that at least convinced me that there's merit behind the ghost stories, that first class swimming pool is active. The best piece I caught, and I'm surprised we didn't hear it because it was loud on all of our recorders. And what I did is I planted recorders all around the 4 corners of that room because I wanted to see what was inside the room itself and what was outside the room. Because one of the things that I had noticed immediately about that first class swimming pool is number one, it's an echo chamber. Number two, there's multiple doors leading into it. It's not just one, and that sound from hallways and from outside can really bleed in. And so when you've already got an echo chamber, you've got outside noise seeping in, it can create the false illusion that you're hearing paranormal stuff. Okay, so that's why I rigged everybody. Everybody had their own handheld recorder. Then I put recorders on each of the 4 corners, so it was pretty heavily mic'd. I will say that we caught a male, and it was from primarily to the side of the swimming pool where no one was around, and it said very loudly, "Listen." It was like a real loud whisper, "Listen." And it was just one word, but I mean, it is clear as a bell. I mean, it is, and I'm shocked that we didn't hear it. And I'm guessing the reason why we didn't hear it was because it was an echo chamber, and we just heard a noise, and we didn't put 2 and 2 together that was a voice, you know.
Wow.
But the recorder sure caught it. Then there was a piece of audio that I had discarded as inconclusive. It did sound a little bit like someone singing in the background while we were in the first class changing rooms doing a shoot there. And I set it aside because no one was in the main swimming pool area to hear it. And I do know that there was contamination from, cleaning crews around. Yeah. And even the security guard, made noises that he wouldn't take responsibility for. But we discovered in our audio that he was making sounds himself, which my advice to anyone that does this goes to the first class.
Yeah, watch the security guard, people. Watch him.
Like Mike, the security guard, because
watch him.
He may be making sure you had a grand old ghostly time, and he tell that, So
if he does it, chuck him in the water.
Yeah. And if there's no water, then just chuck him, right?
Yeah, chuck him in there anyway.
There's no water in the first class swimming pool anymore.
Isn't there? Oh.
No. However, when I played this audio to the Queen Mary's official paranormal investigator, he lit up and he said, "I recognize that song immediately," and he played me clips that he had caught over the years. And it was very similar. So that moved from inconclusive to paranormal. But I never would have known that had I not had someone corroborate it, But there's supposed to be a singing female that it almost sounds like the idea behind it, no one's really seen this ghost, but they suspect because it's singing kind of a sad, slow lullaby that they think it might be a nurse. But it could be anything,
It could. Sorry, darling. It could be somebody cleaning the dressing rooms or something like that. Singing as she's sweeping up the loose hair or something. I'll let Christian talk now. I'm getting myself into trouble.
Well, I'm not surprised to find a male voice in the swimming pool because. Most people don't know this, but a few do, that during the war years, when it was a troop transport ship, it was not operational as a swimming pool. What they did is they made those barracks, and they piled barracks almost to the top of the ceiling. I mean, they tried to fit as many servicemen as possible in every single space of that ship. And so that's what that was during the war years. And so it had to have been incredibly uncomfortable. Can you imagine, bunks stacked up 5, 6 levels tall, just crazy. And there were always more servicemen than there were bunks. So most people don't know that. But so you had...
They used to turn around, didn't they?
Yeah,
whoever was on duty at the time, the others slept. When they came off,
exactly.
And vice versa.
It'd be like 6-hour shifts where you had the bunk, and then you had to give it up to the next person. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how they got by.
Yeah. Christian, you wanted to say something?
Oh,
I'm going to let Christian take over for a little while, Craig, if that's all right with you.
That's all right. I was just trying to tie in with what Craig has already said and yourself, Irene. It said in its history that when it was being used during the troop movements, that at its height there was 16,000 people on the ship trying to find space. That's a lot of people. In a very emotional time, in a very confined space, probably being jolted around in the sea as well. I mean, there's a lot of real pure emotion that's been stored up in that environment, and
yes.
I think that makes an impact on the fabric of a building or a ship in this case, and I think sometimes, I'm going to say something now that I don't know if anyone will agree with it, but I think sometimes spiritual entities that appear in spaces might not necessarily have been human. They more encapsulate a pure emotion. And they sort of, it's very difficult for me to explain this, but they're not necessarily a person. But they appear as a person, and they're generating like a pure energy emotion. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Like a trickster.
I don't think they're trying to trick us. I think the ghost kind of encapsulates the innocence of that time and how that emotion just breaks through and it comes to certain people and they're lucky enough to experience it. But I just wanted to know what Craig thought about the child that has been seen. Do you think that child was actually there, or do you think it was a stowaway, or do you think it was part of the fabric of a specific time of that ship's history? Or
well, the consistent claims from people that have. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Just I can hear you too. Isn't that swell?
That's useful.
The consistent claims about the child ghost is that she's calling for either her mommy or her daddy, but mostly it's her mommy that she's calling for. Different theories, or not theories, but different speculation as to why she's there. One could be that she died during one of the bride and baby voyages. One thing I should note is that when it was a transport ship, the number of people that would leave on board the ship was always different. Less people than when they arrived. So almost every voyage during the World War II years, the numbers never added up.
Right.
There'd be fewer people arriving than leaving. So this leads one to believe that there were deaths on the ship. And they just weren't. It was classified, therefore not reported. Some of them you may never have been able to figure out because they might have jumped, or there could have been murders on there, where a bunch of guys didn't like this one guy because of how he smelled or something, or what he did with his food, or any kind of tension, when you're packed like sardines, could have thrown them overboard. That I would call murder, right? But nothing could be proved, So there are incidents where stuff like that could have happened, and we would have no idea about it. They did transport prisoners of war at times. It was also a transport ship for Churchill. Winston Churchill,
That's right.
on top secret missions. And oftentimes, you want to talk about emotions. Imagine on some of the voyages, Churchill did travel on the Queen Mary with prisoners of war also on board, heading to the United States. I mean, everyone thought that was crazy, but Churchill said, no, let's do it. It's not a big deal, So they had machine gun nests, built in the bowels of the ship, aimed at the prisoners of war. And, Churchill went incognito, and they're still not clear what suite he occupied because it was so top secret. I know that the Queen Mary has a Winston Churchill suite, and it's supposed to be haunted, or at least it used to be. I haven't heard any recent stories about it. But the fact of the matter is Churchill probably stayed in different suites for security reasons. And that's at least what I came across, is that it was very hard for anybody, even during the crossing, to know exactly where Churchill was. Mm. Okay. Now I'm getting back to the child. I think the child ghost is most likely, again, connected with the bride and baby voyages. I think most of the paranormal activity on board the Queen Mary, I wouldn't say 100% by any means, because some of the ghostly claims seem to suggest, passengers, regular passengers during the luxury liner years. But it seems to me that the majority of the paranormal claims seem to be World War II related. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense, because it would have been a very intense time, a very anxious time. A time when all those soldiers would have been fixed on their families, wherever they were. They would have been thinking about their children. They would have been thinking about their loved ones. They would have been. I mean, it one way energy can conjure up, these pure emotions that can almost generate a ghost. Almost, I don't know. They can sort of conjure it up because of the intensity and the worry and the. Do you see what I mean? It can almost trigger it. Almost. It can trigger
the conditions were not normal conditions when they were all on there, the troops and everything. Because the Falklands, for a start, they're the QE2, Queen Elizabeth. Mm. She was put into service. She was painted up, disguised. She was loaded up with thousands of troops, mainly Gurkhas. And on a crossing through to the Falklands, she went blind. In other words, no sonar, no lights on, no nothing. Everything went black. And that's how she had to sail. Yeah. Nobody knew that ship was moving. Nobody knew it was moving.
Yeah, when the Queen Elizabeth wasn't even ready yet when the war broke out. So
no, this was the Falklands War with Argentina.
Yeah.
So it must have been more or less the same conditions, Yeah.
Well, another thing I want to point out that I had meant to point out before I got where I derailed myself is that a lot of hauntings can either be done, through tragedy and certainly an emotional connection.
Yeah.
And I believe that the vast majority of hauntings are emotionally connected. Mm. However, let's not discount those that absolutely love that place, or in this case, love the ship.
Yeah.
And there definitely seems to be, some of the ghosts definitely seem to be some Cunard White Star employees.
Loved the ship, loved their job, loved everything about it.
Exactly. And they might have died on the job, but that's exactly what they would have probably wanted, you know. That is, if they can, you know, be among the 1% wealthiest people, I think they would probably pick that. But since they weren't going to be, they loved the ship, you know, and everything that the ship entailed and their duties entailed. And there may just be some passengers that, you know, that was one of their happiest times when you're doing that crossing and you're starting over with your life, and that sense of magic of and drama, you know, had to have really tweaked everyone, you know, many people's emotions. I know that, like, for instance, the first time I ever visited Russia, I went by myself, you know, and I wasn't part of a tour guide. I wasn't part of anything. I had to pull some strings to get, you know, with the travel agencies to hook me up with a family to stay in. And I didn't know Russian. And so I was going through Moscow like Buster Keaton in a silent film. I was miming everything. I was Chaplin. I was Keaton, you know. And but I guarantee you, for my 17 days there, all of my senses were super heightened. And it's just one of those rare moments in your life where you literally have to live by your wits, you know, wits end. And so my sight seemed sharper. My hearing was, and just what I call my spidey sense. Well,
you definitely needed that if you were out there in the Cold War, I tell you.
Yeah. Well, no, I wasn't there during the Cold War. I wouldn't have been allowed. But I'm going to go off track a little bit. But my other advice is, if you ever go to Russia by yourself, do not dress like James Bond. You will get stopped every time by police.
Can I?
I did that, and man, I got grief almost.
No, this is it. Their idea of spies are James Bond.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't wear black turtlenecks, you don't wear dark sunglasses, and you don't wear dark gray trench coats.
No.
You will get flagged as a spy everywhere you go.
Or a walking cliche, yeah.
Can I come in with a question there, please?
Sure.
Craig, would you say that you were haunted by history? I ask that because of your photography work that you do. I know we're changing the subject slightly from Queen Mary and Cold War Russia, but would you say you're haunted by history because of your photography work? You seem to have a fascination with, especially, you know, that you brought a book out, Haunted by History Volume 1. You're fascinated by what seems to be the 1930s, 1940s, these reenactments of photographs that you do. I'm looking at one right now in front of me of a gentleman that looks like Charlie Chaplin laid on the floor, but I think somebody's trying to strangle him.
Yeah.
It looks like he's got a rope or something. Oh no, it's his cane. It's his walking stick that he's holding up. Yeah. Are you fascinated by this? And when you've reenacted these photographs, have you ever experienced anything ghostly or anything paranormal?
Oh yes, he has.
Yes. Well, that's kind of the purpose of the photos. I mean, there's a couple of different purposes for it, but one of the purposes is to actually try to engage with the paranormal, assuming that what we're dealing with is intelligent. And I operate from the perspective that if there is a ghost there and it is an intelligent ghost, then you should be able to play psychological games with it. And so that's what I was trying to do.
So what's the most unusual experience? Please forgive me if you've already answered this before, but I've not heard you speak before, and I'm fascinated with the reasons and if you've actually experienced anything. What have you experienced?
Yes. Okay. Well, let me. I got interrupted a little bit. So to get back, the Chaplin picture that you're referring to, that is a recreation of a true story that happened at the Alexandria Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and it had to do with a fist fight in 1920 between Charlie Chaplin and Louis B. Mayer in the days before he became the head of MGM. And it happened in the lobby of the hotel. And when I came across that story, I just felt like I need to recreate that. That is such a funny story. And Louis B. Mayer won the fight. So that's kind of why the picture has Louis B. Mayer getting the upper hand in Charlie Chaplin in the photo. And originally I wanted Chaplin to not look like the Tramp, but it was very hard to find someone that looked ideally enough like Charlie Chaplin where you could go, okay, that's Charlie Chaplin, without the makeup, and so because I struggled to find that, Robert Downey Jr. was not available. So
I think it'd cost you a few dollars.
It would have a few more. So I found, I decided to go with the Tramp because the Tramp character is still very easily definable.
Yeah.
Now, to answer your other questions, yes, on numerous occasions, things happen, including at the Alexandria Hotel when I was shooting in the Valentino suite, which was supposed to be haunted. And I was skeptical of it being haunted, but my skepticism was erased when I was shooting this picture of a woman dressed completely in red, and she was in a red room, and that I had furnished and decorated to be kind of 19-teens, maybe early 1920s. And, it was already dark, the sun had set, and it got real gloomy. And suddenly this door that we thought was permanently stuck open, because this room hadn't been redone since like 1970. So the floor in the bathroom was warped, the tile was warped, and this door seemed to be just stuck right in the middle of it, where it couldn't budge. So I didn't want to break the door, so I said, let's just we'll shoot around it. We don't need to close that door. And so we went hours shooting in and around, and then suddenly the leasing agent for the Alexandria Hotel comes by after he gets off work, and I put him in the room where that door was, and I just gave him a flashlight to get him out of the way and say, just shine it through this hallway and shine it on the model in the next room, and we'll get the shot. And so he starts saying at some point, it's getting very cold and I'm getting very frightened back here. Can you hurry up with the shot? He's all by himself. And I said, yeah. We'll get to it. And then suddenly, about 3-4 minutes later, maybe a little longer than that, suddenly that door that we all thought had been wedged open permanently slammed shut on its own so hard that literally all the window glass rattled.
Wow.
And so there were 7 people that were there to that, and we all jumped, and we all knew that wasn't natural. And then, at the Glen Tavern Inn, there was an incident that happened where I was shooting a couple of girls. They were in twin beds, or they were double beds, but I had it staged where it looked like they were staying in twin beds, and the shadow is coming down upon them, the shadowy hand. And while I was lining up that shot, I had left the door slightly ajar because I had 2 other crew members ghost hunting around the building, and I didn't want them knocking and disturbing, and they didn't have a key card, so I just left the door slightly ajar. So I heard the doorknob turn, and I'm right by the door. And so I turned to look, expecting to see them coming in the door. But what I saw instead was that door open, and then it closed all by itself with no one on the other side.
Wow.
And one of the models that was in the shot, she saw it. And she and I just exchanged a look like, did you see that? That was incredible. And the other person didn't see it, but that's because she was texting her boyfriend in Australia. Missed the whole thing.
Unbelievable, absolutely. There is something about the old style noir photography, isn't it, that makes it stand out, even from some of the modern images that we get today. I'm thinking of the images like of Marlene Dietrich and people like that. They're absolutely beautiful actresses, beautiful at what they did. But the style of the photography was something that was fantastic.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm influenced by German Expressionism of the 1920s. I'm influenced by silent films and also the films of the 1930s. And the still photography that was done back then, you don't really see that now. But the way the stills were shot back then was that every picture told a story.
Yeah.
And you look at stills now, and it's just two guys looking at each other, looking like they're in conversation, and that's about it,
Yeah.
Or you'll see a guy running across the hood of a car, with a gun in his hand, and that's it, or an explosion. But back then, there were a lot more details, and I guess the reason why that has always appealed to me is that I would go to these old, living in LA, I'd go to these movie memorabilia stores. And half the time I didn't even know who the movie stars were. And I'm going through all of these file folders filled with stars. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for photos that intrigue me and tell the story, because I haven't seen the movie. In some cases, maybe the silent movie is a lost film altogether. But there's something about that picture that elicits an emotional response from me, because my imagination fills in what the scenario is, or what it could possibly be about. So I would say that has inspired me in my own style in doing these things. It's kind of like, I want the picture to tell a story. I want the location, the haunted location that I'm shooting in, I want it to be a character as well.
Yeah.
So I want these models to interact with each other, but also in its own way, they're acting with the location itself.
Absolutely. Of course, and of course, if you get the setup right as well, that could, make, if there are any spirits there, any ghosts there, it could make them come out, as you say, as well, which is, basically what you're there to do. But
Right.
I have an influence as well. It's the thing that influences me with my photography is making sure I get the wedding booked so I can pay my bills at the end of the month. That's usually my influence. Yeah.
Well, no, the photos are for sale. The prints are for sale, and I've sold a few of them. And just as people see it and word gets around, I've had a couple of it's been exhibited a couple of places locally in the LA area, and I've actually got an exhibit coming up on. Well, I'll be part of a larger exhibit. Opens May 25th.
Yeah.
So,
well, I do wish you every success in the future with what you're doing there, because I think your work is absolutely fantastic.
You're not the only one that thinks it's
It is good, isn't it, Irene?
Yeah,
it's
it's
absolutely
great.
brilliant.
I told you that this is today, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, I've had a good look at his website. Now, as we've got about 25 minutes left, guys, can I ask just one more question, then I'll back out the way again. What future plans are you working on at the moment, Craig?
well, right now I'm working on a podcast, launching a podcast to talk about forgotten stories, forgotten crimes, and bring on other people as well. Who knows? I may have you guys out there on my show, but. I'm trying to ready, more books, more little books around there. I got a chance to, see Mae West's apartment where she lived and died out here in LA, and she's supposedly haunts it. So I'm still kind of investigating. I didn't really get a chance to investigate that place per se. But it was very cool to see it, and I definitely woke up the next morning, felt like, geez, did I just spend the night partying with Mae West? Felt completely drained the next day. despite not with the worst hangover ever, despite the fact that I didn't have a single drop of alcohol at that place. So there are a lot of little niches and old Hollywood ghost stories that I still am hoping and working on trying to get my foot in the door. Aside from that, just to keep on writing, keep promoting the book, getting the other haunted hotels out there, doing events. I did an event last month at the Pierpont Inn in Ventura, California, and that was pretty interesting. Once again, the paranormal activity was a little slow, but once I got one of the people helping me out in a 1930s dress and with a 1930s look, it seemed to me that relatively not long after that, the paranormal activity seemed to spike a little bit more, and we were able to document, more odd stuff happening there. So I'm a firm believer in what I do, and of course, working as a photographer always helps.
Absolutely. Just there is one case, of course, which is quite famous I believe it was in LA. If I'm incorrect, please forgive me. But the Black Dahlia case. Have you ever thought of reenacting like something to do with that?
There's someone that follows me on Facebook and Instagram who kind of trolls me about the Black Dahlia almost weekly. And even just a few hours before coming on board this, he says, you really should look into the Black Dahlia. You really should look into the Black Dahlia. So I'm kind of contemplating that. The problem I've always had with the Black Dahlia case is that there are so many books, and there's so many people thinking they have solved the murder, and some are louder than others, and they're all fighting with one another as to, oh, you're lying, or you're wrong, you're this and you're that. And so do I really want to walk into that? Because I'm the type of person that will fact check everything, every line by line, know. And so it's not something I can do in 2 weeks. When you're dealing with an unsolved murder, the Black Dahlia, you really have to look at all angles, and you have to find the weaknesses and the strengths of everyone's argument or conspiracy theory as to what really happened. So I'm open to doing that. I think I'm moving into place to do that. There have been too many people have asked me to get involved in that, and so maybe I need to. It's just once you open up a case and go into it, because I literally approach it like a detective.
Yeah, it's like opening up Pandora's box, isn't it? Yeah,
you just start falling down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and fortunately, when you get real, involved in it, magic things do tend to happen, where you'll find that piece of information that you've been looking for. Or you'll find that sense of corroboration, But there are an awful lot of Black Dahlia experts out there, so I don't know whether having another one pop up is going to do any good.
Yeah, it's exactly the same over here in Great Britain with the Jack the Ripper case. Everybody's got a theory on who it was. From
got an opinion.
A young royal member of the royal family up to like an immigrant from Lithuania or Russia or something like that.
Yeah.
One was even American, an American who came over and went back to America. So it's a Pandora's box. I'm going to back out again now. Thank you for answering my questions. Anyway, I really appreciate it.
Christian?
Oh, yeah. I once listened to a story that Talisa Vallis talked about once in a very strange experience he had when he was quite young. He was a young man. Before he was famous, he was broke, and he kept running out of gas, or petrol as we call it over here. And there was this one time, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Craig, he talks about getting picked up by a mystery man who helped him out. and he had a very strange, high-pitched voice, and he accepted the kindness of this person, and offered him a lift, and he got a lift, and he said, "Thanks very much. Look, I'm really broke. I can't give you any money today, but can I send you some money? Can I wire you some money?" And this guy said, "Yeah, sure. So here's my number." And then he dropped him off, and then forgot all about it for a couple of weeks. And then when he got paid, he then phoned the number. And when he phoned the number, he only got through to a lady who answered and said, "Who's this? Who's this?" And he said, "Look, I'm looking for this man called John," or whatever his name was. And this lady said, "Are you some kind of prank caller? I mean, what do you want John for?" And he explained, Telly Savalas explained that he got picked up by this man called John, and he had a high-pitched voice. And she said, "Look, if you're some kind of weirdo, you need to get off the line, because my husband's been dead for 2 years."
Yeah. There's a lot
Wow.
of those. There are
Yeah,
a
there's
lot
quite
of
a few of those. Yeah.
But it
Phantom
gets
Hitchhiker and one thing or another.
it gets even more interesting, because
Why?
she said, when you mentioned the high-pitched voice, and apparently he shot himself in the throat.
Oh,
Now that's really significant, because his throat would have been distorted had that have happened. And the interesting thing was he mentioned something really random in the car as he was driving, and he remembered it. Telly Savalas said, he said, "There's a pitcher who plays for a certain team locally who's going to have a bad day." And he didn't think anything about it. And then literally the day after, he had that phone call where she confirmed it was, they actually met, the ex-wife of the man who gave him the lift. And he described the clothes he was wearing, said that was what he died, the clothes he was wearing. He couldn't have known any of this. He never met this person before.
Yeah.
There was too many coincidences. He knew his full name. He never met this guy before. The throat coincidence, the fact that he was driving a car that he was known to have driven.
Yeah.
There was too many coincidences, and Telly Savalas had no idea who this person was. And on top of that, that pitcher he mentioned actually got dropped from the team, even though he was a star player, that week. So he almost predicted the future, this ghostly apparition, whatever it was. And
Wow.
That I found that so compelling, and that as a story, I'll try and dig it out again. But I think there was a YouTube video of Telly Savalas talking about it. And the thing is, he was a very religious person, so he didn't believe in that sort of thing. He was kind of brought up not to believe in ghosts, so it was completely out of character for him to believe that the spirit world can make contact in that way.
Yeah.
So it kind of broke the preconceptions about our reality, about what is out there, about how we coexist with the spirit world, and it completely changed Telly Savalas' view of the world, as these instances do. So I was just going to come on to which coincidence or something in your life, what triggered you to go on this journey that you're on? What drives you? What moment can you remember in your life that triggered you to go and try and find out the truth about?
I lean more to the belief that I didn't choose it; it chose me.
Okay.
And the reason being is that I've had multiple experiences, and so each one was kind of like a building block. And because I had certainly I have a lot of interests, and I've tried to maintain those interests. I don't want the paranormal to just consume me, or I consume it. So I never in a million years thought I'd be a paranormal person at my age at this point. And in fact, it's part of me is still a little embarrassed about it, but I'm trying to get over it. I'm getting to live with myself now, because I realize that it really kind of chose me, I would say that the first experience happened when I was about 6 years old, and I was living in Mississippi State in the southern half of the United States. The one that was part of the rebellion of the Civil War, and the American Civil War. And basically, my dad was an Air Force pilot stationed at an Air Force base there, and so my mom and I ended up making friends with a family that owned an old pre-Civil War antebellum home. And they had, the owners of this home had a child that was roughly about my age. So they would drop me off and we would visit, almost every weekend or every other weekend to have play dates. Well, at some point I found out that there's a ghost girl that haunts this mansion. And it was a secret back then. It wasn't a well-known told tale. It now is, but, in 1971, 72, it wasn't. But once I caught wind of it as a child, I started looking for the ghost. I wanted to see that cemetery, that was across the road. I wanted to, I wanted, I guess, really badly to experience that ghost girl. Now, I don't have any memory of me meeting her. There was only one time I had a sleepover where I woke up in the middle of the night. I was on the ground floor of this 3-story, mansion, and I got real scared. And I was a little ticked off that, I was there. Because apparently what had happened is, our families got together for dinner. Gage, my friend, and I were out playing, and they decided, well, it's getting late. We're not ready to leave yet. We're still conversing. So you guys, we'll set you up to go to sleep. And they must have just thought, oh, we'll let little Craigie sleep all night, And so I woke up around midnight, and I'm like, what am I doing here on the floor? So I got scared and had them call my parents, and I think my dad came and picked me up. And he was mad at me, but all I remember was being in the comforts of my bed and, home sweet home. He could have chewed me out for another hour, 2 hours. It would have made no difference. I did not want to stay the night there that night.
Well, but, maybe you felt something. Instinctively.
That's a real possibility, too. I mean,
this was a Waverley mansion, wasn't it?
Yes. And I've spent the night there before with no issue. So why that night was an issue, I don't know. I mean, part of me wishes I could almost go under hypnosis by someone that can try to recall what went on that night, because I'd love to know. But whatever it is, it's either I don't remember or it was deliberately blocked. But I don't have any memory other than just waking up being scared.
We do have this built-in instinct of oncoming danger, so maybe that's something that you as a child picked up on but couldn't understand what the emotion you were feeling.
Yeah, and then the second thing happened when I was 20 years old and living in an efficiency in Odessa, Texas, and had about a handful of weird things happen in this 1970s building. And there were moments where I thought it was haunted, but it was few and far between, and life would go on. And a lot of the stuff that happened, like tapping on the shoulders or objects moving on their own or something, I just racked up to my own overactive imagination. I was always real dismissive. Until I met the guy that moved in right after me. And then once he pulled me aside at a party and asked me if that place was haunted, and he started telling me the things that were happening to him, that opened my eyes in a big way, because some of the things that had happened to me were now happening to him. And suddenly it dawned on me that all the stuff that I had just written off and rationalized as just being, my own imagination, turned out to not be that. That wasn't the case. Because someone else had experienced the same darn things. So that opened another doorway. That was like another building block. Then I would say the third and final building block, before actually beginning to commit more and more to the paranormal, was I was working as a production assistant at Warner Brothers on the studio lot in Burbank. And one night, it just happened to be Halloween, so no one's going to believe me. I was brought in early to make scripts and deliver them, to put them on the sound stage. It happened to be the oldest sound stage on the Warner Brother lot, and I had been working for months on different shows there. So I'd been there all hours of the night, all hours of the early morning, all hours of the day. Nothing ever happened. But that one night on Halloween, I go in there and the lights are acting crazy. The whole 30-minute time that I was inside that sound stage, I was the only one in there. But when I climbed the stairs to drop off a bundle of books, I became aware of a woman speaking somewhere on that stage. And once I heard the voice, I just stopped everything. I didn't have a recorder, didn't have cell phone back then, but I did have a pager. So I just said, I'll stay here for 20, 25 minutes and try to figure out what that sound is. And that voice kept talking and talking and talking. There'd be pregnant pauses, no sound cues. I eliminated just about any possibility of what it could be. And it was gibberish. I mean, I could not quite make out what this woman was saying, which drove me nuts. Nor could I exactly pinpoint where she was, other than because it always seemed like it was moving, you know. But it was somewhere down below me. And so once I sneaked down there as quietly as possible to see if I could creep up on whatever it was that was there, it stopped by the time I hit the bottom of the stairs. But that wasn't it. I was genuinely getting a little scared in that sound stage. It was like a real heavy feeling where it was like my senses were saying, run, escape. You know, so I just kind of dropped the scripts off in the middle of the stage. And as I'm walking, I don't ever like to show that I'm scared. So as I'm walking all the way across this large sound stage, I became aware of women's heels walking right behind me. And I thought, that's insane. It's, you know, so I waited till I said, well, I'm still thinking someone's pulling a prank on me. I'm at Warner Brothers. These are movie people. It's Halloween. Someone's is pulling a practical joke on me. So I'm going to figure this one out. So I waited till it was, where I felt like the steps were coming closer, were actually gaining. So I suddenly stopped and spun around like a gunfighter, you know, and no one was there. But what was odd is that the footsteps didn't stop when mine stopped. It was like a little hiccup, and then it stopped. And I thought, okay, so it's not me and it's not an echo. So I turned around and started walking, and I got about 2-3 steps, and then that click-clack of heels. And it wasn't just women's heels. It was the swooshing of, like, fabric, like someone wearing a gown or something, you know. It's definitely female. Whatever was meant to sound like a female following me, which is odd because I'd heard a female voice earlier. So I waited till we got into the wide open space where there's nothing anyone can do to turn around and hide. There was no set pieces, no props, no anything. And it sounded like this lady was literally 10 feet behind me. And I stopped and spun around again, and no one was there. And again, there was like a stutter step before it stopped. So it wasn't in sync with my footsteps at all. So that was when I decided I'm going to do almost a run to the door. So I walked.
Come on, Craig, own up. You bolted it, didn't you?
No, but I did say something smarmy, you know, before we entered the room and turned off the light. And I was shaking like a leaf while I was having a couple of cigarettes outside the sound stage going, what was that? You know, that was 30 minutes of weirdness. And so, you know, I tried to ask around. Of course, nobody at work, you know, with the production, they didn't want to hear it. They didn't believe it. They were like, oh, yeah, really? Halloween, really? And I went, ah. So that was the third building block, is that from now on, I'm going to document. If any weird thing happens, they're documented. Now, I will say, in hindsight, it took about 20 years for me to get corroboration on this, but I finally met a security guard at Warner Brothers, and I started saying, hey, well, I got you post here. I'm going to tell you the story that happened to me. Before I could even finish the story, he knew exactly what soundstage it was.
Oh, wow.
There you go.
Unbelievable. Okay, I'm just going to interject there, folks. We've got less than 4.5 minutes left.
Okay, so while we're at it then, Craig's book, I will say it again, Haunted by History, and his website. You can obtain the book from his website, which is, here we go, www.bizarrela.com or Amazon.
I did it
You can
right
get it Amazon UK, Amazon.com, Amazon everywhere.
Okay, is it available on Amazon UK?
Yes, it is.
Ah,
I saw
that's
it.
wonderful to hear. That's wonderful to hear. I knew it was like on Amazon Japan and Amazon India, but and I was thinking, God, that's weird, you know. But I would love for it to be on Amazon Australia and Amazon UK. That's definitely encouraging to hear.
You should go on all the Amazons, really. You know, my books are on France, Germany, everywhere. So
Well,
eventually they do get over them.
I don't have control over my Amazon. My distributor has it, so it really there's not much I can do. It's really up to them to push it forward to those levels.
Anyway.
And
I was just going to also, let's say it again. Let me say it again, please. I'm making it right this time. www.bizarrela.com.
Yes.
You've got the job, Irene. You've got the job.
You've got the job.
Yeah.
And also I have if you're into Etsy, I have a Haunted by History on Etsy, and I actually sell, this is where I kind of sell a few of the props and pieces that were in the photos, but I also sell books there as well.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, so, right, this is it, isn't it? We're all finished?
Well, we've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, 2 minutes. Right, so I want to say thank you to my new co-host, Christian Delaney.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been a really, really good experience. Really
You've done
pleased.
very well, and thank you, Chris, as well. But most of all, thank you, Craig, for coming on the second time. And putting
Thanks
up
for
with us.
having me. Yeah.
Oh, I love having you on here. I love it.
That was very enjoyable. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's great.
Excellent.
I'm
I love your
trying hard not
photography.
to slip into a British accent talking to you. I love hearing you guys talk, and I'll start aping you in a little bit, and it's all subconscious, you know.
Well, Craig, you do know, of course, Craig, how you can get the British accent back correctly, don't you? Get rid of your presidents and come back to the royalty. Come back.
Yeah.
Forget 1776. Just come back.
Yeah, we're getting our own royalty, it seems like.
Very soon. Very
Yeah.
soon. You have your own.
We definitely have someone acting like a king, you know, instead of the president.
Well, I wasn't going to say get rid of Trump, but now you've said that, I will do. Yeah. Well, no, that's as far as I want to go with that. I actually find that when I focus too much on politics, it's low vibration stuff. I mean, I've got better. I don't want to sound elitist, but when I think of other things, I'm much happier. Let's put it that way.
Well, we try not to talk about politics at all now with what's going on over here with Brexit.
Yeah.
So we try to keep off of that. Are we up now?
We have got 24 seconds to go, so let's call it a night.
Okay, everybody, before you go, we can be found just about everywhere. So, that's it. From me, over and out. From Chris, over and out. And from Christian, over and out. And Craig, we love you. We're your biggest fans.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, bye.